Well, I'm so glad that you all came out today on a beautiful day. My lecture is called Art and the Cry of Nature, based upon my forthcoming book. And today I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to challenge the Chicago Humanities Festival to change its name. You can guess what it should be. The Chicago Animalities Festival. And secondly, I'm going to suggest that this challenge to the humanities has been made many times before, and particularly under the rubric of what I call the cry of nature, which is a motif that's found in works by philosophers, poets, writers, and artists from roughly the 17th century to the present. So I'll be giving you a kind of rapid survey of these issues, of the question of the conflict, if you will, between animalities and humanities, and the idea that one can challenge the dominance of the human over the animal, and that one, in fact, should do so. The challenge to the humanities is going to be based upon three propositions. The first is that the word humanities expresses an exclusivity and human superiority that has no basis in science. The second is that for the first approximately 80,000 years of human history, and can I have the first image on, please? Thank you. This is an Aboriginal so-called X-ray style painting from roughly 6,000 years BCE, and it shows what's probably a dolphin, although it looks a bit more like a tortoise. It's painted in a style to indicate the inside of the animals, and it was a part of the so-called dreaming, the origin mythologies of the Aboriginal peoples, in which a great force swept over the land and created simultaneously the land, the animals, the people all at once. So all those things are the product of the same animating force. As I say, for the first 80,000 years of human history, people believed that the difference between humans and animals were relatively few, and indeed that one could be changed into the other, animal into human, human into animal. So the prejudice of humans towards animals is a relatively modern invention, contingent upon the current or the then prevailing economic and social order. And having recognized that, we should also realize that that prejudice can be changed. It isn't something that's hardwired into us by nature, but something that can be changed according to our interests, our needs, and our social and economic life. That's the second proposition. The third is that, in fact, many writers and artists have provided logical models for rejecting the prejudice that we'll call humanism or humanitiesism. They have participated in an ongoing liberation struggle, we can call it the cry of nature, that aims to grant basic rights to non-human animals. So the first two sections of my talk will be quite brief, so that we have plenty of time to look at the works of art and to take questions from you all. Part one. It's often been claimed that humans alone possess the capacities and skills that entitle them to life, liberty, and happiness. These capacities include sentience, that is the capacity to experience pain and pleasure, language use, tool use, emotion, empathy, close family ties, and the possession of culture. These are things that have traditionally been said to belong to humans alone. Absent these abilities, it's been argued, an animal cannot suffer from the denial of freedom or even the loss of life. The idea, therefore, is that lacking appreciation of the sweetness of life, the deprivation of it cannot be bitter. But recent scientific research calls into question any capacities-based argument for the denial of moral consideration, or rights, if you will, to animals. There's little doubt, for example, that animals experience pain. Scientific reason, or what's called scientific parsimony, scientific parsimony meaning that the simplest explanation is generally the right one, absent any other complications. Scientific parsimony requires us to accept that shared external reactions of humans and other animals to physical or psychological trauma. This is a image from Darwin's book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animal, from 1872. We should recognize that these reactions, recoiling, shrieking, crying, shaking, facial or bodily contortion, as here, reactions of flight or aggression reveal common affective experience. In other words, also from Darwin's book. In other words, if it looks like pain, and if it sounds like pain, it's probably pain. Moreover, recent laboratory research using positron emission tomography to produce a three-dimensional image of bodily processes indicates that animals and humans feel and experience emotional as well as physical pain and pleasure in similar ways. And this slide just shows some results of experimentation on children and infants and on rats, indicating their responses to certain pleasurable sensations, sweetness, satisfaction of thirst, other flavors. And this kind of experimentation was carried out on a very wide basis, particularly with humans and primates, but also with humans and rats. It indicates that when humans and animals experience emotional and physical pleasure, it shows up in their brains in the same places. So in other words, one can track these experiences in both animals. When subjected to a deprivation or a disappointment, or to the joy of seeing a favorite companion, non-human primates and other animals react similarly to humans, and the same regions of their brain are activated in similar ways. Language use also is now widely understood to be common to humans and animals. Great apes, whales, dolphins, and several bird species. This is the great Alex, now deceased. He was the gray parrot who belonged to the researcher Irene Paperberg, who learned to master extraordinary tools, including syntax. That is the capacity to use different words and to combine them together to make new meanings. So for example, if you gave her something she hadn't tasted before, like an apple, but she had tasted cherries before and bananas, she might say something like appa-banana, that she'd pick a symbol of that, or she'd be able to say it because parrots, can speak. So there are extraordinary abilities there. It's now understood that in addition to parrots, of course, great apes, whales, dolphins can do these kinds of things. They can express their aversions, their preferences. They can show their intentions. They can describe and enumerate objects that are brought before them, even things they haven't seen before. Prairie dogs are capable of making sounds to indicate the type of predator they may be approaching, whether it's coming by land or air, or even if it's a particular predator that has been seen before. I was recently in Texas, and I went to a nature preserve where there are prairie dogs. And they were all sitting up on their burrows, watching for people to come by. And as I ran by, I was jogging. I saw a prairie dog make this squeal to another one, and they all dashed off. And I thought that he was shouting, "Stupid jogger coming." I could almost tell that. Beyond that, prairie dogs from different colonies are known to express their thoughts in different ways, indicating that their language is invented and passed down from children to their young, and not something that's simply inherited by virtue of birth. So a different prairie dog colony will use different sounds to indicate the same kinds of things. Vervet monkeys have different calls based upon the predators that they see. So if a hawk is flying overhead, they'll make one cry, which indicates that you should hide in the bushes. If a snake comes by, a different cry will be made, meaning you should run away, because they can easily outrun snakes. If it's a lion, it means they should climb up a tree. And these are taught from parents to young. It's been observed that mothers will chastise their young if they get it wrong. So a child vervet may yell eagle when in fact is a lion, and the mother will then give him a rap on the side of the head that he got it wrong. There's an experiment recently done at the University of Chicago showing that empathy is characteristic of laboratory rats. When confronted with a trapped rat, a free rat will do anything it can to liberate its cage mate, even when distracted by chocolate, one of its favorite foods. In this experiment, after liberating the caged rat, the hero in the experiment offered the freed rat a piece of the chocolate in celebration. And I can actually show just a tiny bit of this. This is just showing the rat who's, for the first time, learned how to open the door. You see the rat in the middle is caught in this jar, and the other rat is trying to figure out how to open it. He keeps pushing at the door, and he can't get it open. And then toward the end of the first day, as you'll see in a moment in real time, 5 days. See, now they're greeting each other, they're chasing each other, they're like kissing. And this is really a good study because it was done with lots of blind tests of all kinds to see whether these reactions were simply, if you will, instinctive reactions. So it's quite clear that these animals were reacting based upon the empathy for the caged rat. So one after another, traditional distinctions between human and non-human animal have fallen away. Pleasure and pain, play, tool use, language, learning, and culture are no longer considered the sole domain of humans. Consciousness, memory, emotion, and empathy might therefore be characteristic of animals as well as humans, and the differences between them, between animals and humans, increasingly appear to be ones of quantity, not quality. And this idea, of course, is very much in keeping with classic evolutionary theory, which posits continuity among species, provided that a given character is adaptive to its evolutionary niche. So the idea is that there aren't great leaps in evolution. There's a continuity unless there's a great need because of the adaptive characteristics. It'd be highly unlikely, therefore, that consciousness were adaptive only for humans. After all, it's a thing that allows one to read the emotions of people and other creatures along with you, and to have a sense of your own being, to be able to interact with your environment. So thus the argument for the denial of moral right, life, liberty, and happiness to complex animals on the basis of their diminished capacity must collapse in the face of the mountain of evidence for animal intelligence and empathy. Obviously, I've given you only a tiny, tiny snippet of that kind of mountain, a grain of sand, if you will, of the mountain of evidence. And there's tremendous scholarship out there about animal knowledge and animal intelligence. Now, part two of my talk, which concerns the prejudice of humans toward animals in modern, to say that the prejudice is modern and is contingent upon social and economic conditions and therefore might be changed in the future. The very idea of a fundamental human-animal divide is simply not one to which humans have universally subscribed. Though humans have always scavenged and sometimes hunted, they are primarily herbivores by evolutionary design. Thus, unlike lions and wolves, we don't instinctively see other large animals as prey. When we walk down the street and see a dog, we don't want to lunge at it and put it in our teeth, whereas a lion instinctively wants to do that. Indeed, for much of human history, people have viewed animals as persons, as possessing what we call personhood, seeing them as friends or even relatives, with all the fraught complexity that those terms imply. People who are hunter-gatherers, also known as foragers, whose life ways characterized the first 80 to 100,000 years of human history, people who had no settled location or settled occupation, for that matter, and who moved around from place to place and gathered food where they could, plants and sometimes animal matter. They believe themselves to be kindred with animals, reincarnations of animals, or the product of the same animating life force that brought animals, and indeed the earth too, into existence. This is a slide I show you by an Inuit artist named Simon Tuukome, now deceased, and it's called I Am Always Thinking of Animals. And the Inuit Eskimos are hunter-gatherers, and it shows really a figure, a hunter or a member of the Inuit people, who has out of his mind all the animals with which he has interaction. And indeed, to distinguish himself or his mind, his soul, from that of other animals would be impossible. This general belief is called animism, and animism even survives among us in limited ways. our wish to give animation to inanimate things. Our strong attachments to our pets might be an animist thing, the way we take pets into our lives and believe them to be members of the family. I read a survey recently that 90% of people give their pets presents on their birthdays and celebrate the holidays with them. So indeed, we still have a residual, if you will, element of the animist within us, but much of our society functions to repress or to make that sentiment very unavailable to us. Ancient and modern pastoralists, those who herded animals, different from hunter-gatherers, and they sometimes killed animals, understanding, however, that animals shared many of the same life world, shared the same life world as they. If a pastoralist kills an animal, it's an important act in their lives. They recognize the significance of it, and it's never done lightly. These are the Sami people, a slide of a Sami, a Laplander. The relationship between pastoralists and their herds, between the Sami, for example, and the reindeer, is so close and mutually beneficial that sometimes it's difficult to say who is herding whom. Humans may therefore possess what has been called an animal connection, an intimate and reciprocal bond with animals that began with early hominids more than 2.5 million years ago, and includes the adoption or alloparenting of non-human animals, domestication, nurturance, communication, cohabitation, and codependence. Violation of this primitive connection has come at the expense of an essential part of ourselves. Humans without a vital bond with other animals, it could be argued, are not fully human. Now, part 3, and that is my discussion of European artists and writers who have understood this animal connection and made it a part of their work. Artists who have exposed what I would call, after the phrase of Rousseau, the cry of nature. From the 16th century forward, debate raged in Europe about whether animals had the right to kindness or to any protection. Most authors, citing biblical and ancient Stoic texts, claimed that animals had no such rights. The philosopher Rene Descartes, who's shown here in a painting after Frans Hals, Descartes even argued that animals were impervious to pain, that their outcries during vivisection, that is, experimentation on live animals, which Descartes participated in, that those outcries during the vivisection were nothing more than the creaks and groans of machines who were being moved in some way, that's all. However, the essayist Michel de Montaigne, a little bit before Descartes, argued by contrast that animals possess sensitivity, intelligence, and even language. If they can't understand me, Montaigne argued, and I can't understand them, whose intelligence is the weaker? He also wrote, "When I play with my cat, who knows if I am not a pastime to her more than she is to me?" The slide is of a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci, believed to have been a vegetarian. He may have asked that question himself about 75 years before. By the middle of the 17th century, during a period that's been called carnivorous Europe, this is a period when the quantity of meat eating was at a tremendous high. Even the poorest peasants would be eating pork with almost every meal. And that if one traveled from town to town or went into taverns, you'd see great stacks of plates and salvers of meat of all sorts. You'd see birds of every kind in the markets, bitterns, herons, egrets, songbirds, all laid out for consumption and purchase. At the height of that period, we begin to have the beginnings of a turning of the tide in the attitude toward the rights of animals. If you look at paintings like this one by David Teniers, the Dutch artist of the middle of the 17th century, or Jan Victor's, we see animals who are props in a genre scene, a scene of daily life. So this is a butcher shop, and we see a great pig hung up, and then in the right is a woman who's preparing a slab of meat. In the background is a man who's carrying a bucket of blood out to the street, perhaps to dump it out. A maid next to him are chatting. You can see the head of another animal on the bench at the lower left, a fish hanging from the wall. This is about the luxury and the abundance of meat that's available. an image here of a pork butcher out in a stall on the street. You see a slab of pork on a hunk of wood there for chopping at the lower right. And you see a young man at the lower left with some salted pork, probably about to sell it to the woman, to probably a servant, standing, kneeling, bending over at the left. And then in the middle, a woman who's holding a pitcher of beer, and she's talking to the head butcher who's got the axe in his hand to chop her a piece. And you see at the right, the meat has just been lowered from that crossbar at the upper right. A scene of daily life. This may be an allegory, too, about development of childhood. You see children at the right blowing up a bladder. That's probably the guts of the animal being used as a balloon. But then you turn to a picture like this by Rembrandt called The Flayed Ox. And now the quotidian is completely cast aside. A woman peers from the foot of a doorway at background right, just as we gaze in from the front, and we feel, perhaps like she does, embarrassed to see the once powerful animal so reduced. Its front legs are mere stumps. Its rear legs are unnaturally spread wide. The flesh is scraped and scabbed like a wound, and it entirely lacks its head, present, however, in another version of the same painting by Rembrandt shown here. The Flayed Ox, wrote Sir Kenneth Clark, the great art historian, he says about this picture, has become a tragic image, almost one might say a religious picture. Other scholars have explicitly compared the animal to Christ. And indeed, the crossbeam from which the animal is hung recalls the cross upon which Christ was crucified, as seen, for example, in his painting from 1633, The Crucifixion. I have them here side by side. The point of view in both paintings is slightly from below, and in each the bodies are placed on a diagonal. Each also contains a witness who looks out toward the viewer. You can see the man standing here, looking out toward us. Perhaps the figure's over here as well, and then the figure of the woman who looks out toward us, in order to engage us most directly in this particular drama, to make us participants in the drama. A drawing from about the same time, 1655 to 60 approximately, a drawing by Rembrandt from the same time shows a night scene in a slaughterhouse. But again, it has the angle and the drama that you might expect from a religious picture. It's almost as if the figures in the foreground are bowing down before the crucified creature, whether it be Christ or Peter, who's also shown crucified, sometimes crucified upside down. Nevertheless, however much the artist has drawn upon Christian tradition in the Flayed Ox, its raw materiality makes it a sober or even ironic inversion of the paradigm of sacrifice and resurrection. The death of an ox here is shown to be an event without redemption. It's a very physical, a very material act, not a spiritual thing. And by virtue of the artist's carefully constructed circuit of seeing and being seen, this exchange between the figure in the picture who looks at the animal and looks at us while we're looking at the animal and looking at her at the same time, so too are the deaths of humans seen to be material matters. Humans are animals too, the argument seems to be. And Rembrandt, I would say, of course Rembrandt is the first of many things in the history of European art. He may also be the first of those who held what I would call then an animalist vision of European art, expressive of this cry of nature, the outcry of the pained animal. Soon, many other European artists, however, would expand this vision. William Hogarth made a set of engravings called The Four Stages of Cruelty. And in it, he depicts the rapid descent of one Tom Nero, that's his sort of negative protagonist over here, from petty ruffian to murderer, to illustrate the idea that cruelty to animals is a precondition of general criminality and even to murder. So you can see here the horrors perpetrated by Tom. He's about to put an arrow into the anus of this poor dog. A nicer young man, well-dressed young man, is trying to prevent it. You see somebody else drawing a bit of graffiti here, showing Tom here, and it shows him being hung. as if to predict that if he continues his barbarities, this is the end to which he'll come. And you see other cruelties of bones being tied to the tail of a dog. You see a dog also being cruel here to a cat. And you see a cat being thrown out of a window with like a balloon attached to it. Cats hung upside down to fight one another, and so on. Second play to the four stages of cruelty shows Tom now as someone who drives a carriage. And this is a multitude of cruelties. These four barristers or lawyers have taken this taxi, and they're too heavy. And they should have taken more than one taxi, but they were too cheap. So the horse is broken down. You can see he's broken his leg. And, but rather than to show him sympathy, Tom is simply beating him further. And then you see other cruelties of a man, a drover, who's beating a lamb to death. Its guts coming out of its mouth. A boy here is run over playing with his hoops. He was run over by a carriage driver here. In the back is people playing bull baiting here, torturing of animals. And there's other such things. And then this is plate 3, Cruelty and Perfection, shows what's become of Tom, where he's killed his lover, and he's been arrested for it. The cruelties that he inculcated in his youth have now so developed that he'll kill people as well. And then the last plate shows the reward of cruelty. Tom, who has been hung and killed, you can see the rope still around his neck, is now on the dissecting table. This is a popular entertainment in Britain of the Georgian Britain, and you see people sitting around there, and here's the teacher commanding the medical students who are dissecting the body and boiling the bones to make skulls. Here a dog gets his revenge, if you will. He's chewing on the heart of Tom there. Now, the thing about this picture is that the cruelties in it, the animal cruelty, is so tremendous that it has to be said that the picture is almost certainly more about the brutality to animals than it is about the coarsening of the human character and the likelihood to criminality. That's the main concern of Hogarth, it would seem. And indeed, in Hogarth's autobiographical notes, he wrote the following. He said, "The 4 stages of cruelty," that's the name of this series, "were done in hopes of preventing in some degree that cruel treatment of animals which makes the streets of London more disagreeable to the human mind than anything whatever. It could not be done in too strong a manner, as the most stony hearts were meant to be affected by them." So his goal was to change hearts and minds, indeed, about cruelty to animals. Indeed, by the middle of and end of the 18th century, we see the rise of true animal welfare and animal liberation movements. Animal welfare is about improving the conditions under which animals live, and animal liberation is about freeing them from any kind of constraints whatsoever. The English poets Alexander Pope, William Cooper, and William Blake, the French philosophers Julien Offray de la Métrie and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and many others wrote specifically about the need to end animal suffering. The utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham argued that the proper question about animals shouldn't be, do they think, but can they suffer? And recognition of the fact of suffering demanded, therefore, that the conditions under which animals lived must be improved. Full-scale animal treatises were being produced at the end of the 18th century. At the left is the frontispiece illustration for a treatise by John Oswald called The Cry of Nature. At the right is another treatise from a few years later with an illustration by Thomas Buick called On the Conduct of Man to Inferior Animals, a welfarist treatise, and this one a full-fledged animal liberation treatise, really saying that humans have no right to control, to consume, to kill animals. And the image shows a shamed nature, bounteous, with many breasts, Pomona she is, covering her eyes as the lamb sees her poor baby killed. And in the front you see a plate with a knife on it. Obviously the purpose of the shooting of the animal was for it to be given to food. And this is an outrage, the argument is, against nature. Within a few years, other treatises in vegetarianism were being produced by Percy Shelley, the great poet. Lord Byron was a vegetarian, and many others. Now, this turn toward vegetarianism and animal rights has generally been seen to be the product of a culture called sensibility, which was a new attitude, new fashion for gentleness, kindness, and charity that arose in mid-18th century England. But instead, I think it may have been the very congregation of animals that led to the change in attitudes. Let me explain what I mean. In the middle and later 18th century, large numbers of animals began to be moved through the streets of the great cities of Europe and then later on North America. So at Smithfield Market, for example, you'd have thousands of animals brought through the streets of the cities, causing great tumult and occasionally causing terrible accidents if they would charge over people. But most of all, the noise and sound and smell of the animals was disturbing. And we know from studies this is the Union Stockyards in Chicago. We know from studies from the 1950s that there is a vomeronasal organ that emits a thing and makes animals sensitive to pheromones. And pheromones are things that convey from animal to animal of the same species, possibly interspecies also, the sense of fear and fright. So fear is literally contagious. Fright is literally contagious. So that means that when animals are being brought in large numbers through the streets of these great cities, they would literally infect each other with their fears. There'd be tremendous outcries among the animals. These outcries, in turn, would be heard by the multitudes of people in the cities. A horrific sound and a horrific sight. Possibly the people themselves were affected by the pheromonal secretions of these animals. And so in that sense, we could say the animals themselves were demanding, by their expressions of fear and by their outcries, the cry of nature, if you will, they were demanding their liberation. Now, they weren't able to organize themselves in interest groups carrying placards or protest signs, but they nevertheless protested nonetheless. And these protests were heard by people. And it was at this time that the beginnings of animal rights movements were formed in the treatises that I've described before, and the formation of animal rights organizations and animal welfare organizations, including, for example, the Society for the Protection of Animals in England, various other humane societies all around Europe and the United States. When we look at the work by George Stubbs, we see another step taken, if you will, in the creation of an art of animal rights or a cry of nature. An artist of extraordinary sensitivity to animals. He studied animals through dissection and was able to produce images such as this of a zebra of great sensitivity. This was the first zebra that was brought to England in 1862, and it was a great popular favorite at Queen Charlotte's menagerie at Kew Gardens. And Stubbs got this completely right. That is, he recognized the nature of difference between this and, say, a mule. Earlier paintings of zebras, even when they hadn't been seen in Europe, generally showed zebras as simply a mule or a horse with stripes on it, and often the stripes would be going the wrong way. But Stubbs recognized that the ears point in different directions than they do on horses and mules. He recognized the patterns of the stripes above the tail. He recognized the little tuft of fur at the neck of the animal. And perhaps the most extraordinary of all in the pictures in the museum at Yale, the Center for British Art, the Mellon Center, is the expressivity of the face of the animal. So that even though he sees this as a specimen with all the detail, he also recognizes it not simply at the species level, but at the individual level. This is an animal that when one sees it, one has to feel that he has empathized strongly with the creature. The French artist, Theodore Jericho, a great master of drawings, paintings, and lithographs of horses. He recognized the fear of horses, the suffering of animals, and also, if you will, even the class differences among animals. He'll show these thoroughbred racehorses in this lithograph. He'll show percherons and other draft horses, these powerful masterly animals in this one, and then he'll show animals brought to slaughter in this case. If you will, these are the proletarians of the animal world, the working class of animals, and Jericho extremely sensitive to that aspect. He even showed an animal, a dead horse, in a lithograph. Contemporaneous with Jericho was Thomas Buick, showing a horse approaching death after a hard life, that the reward for all of his work is to be set out, not even to pasture, but just to be allowed to die. In works like this, Jericho sought to produce full-scale, what are called history paintings, ambitious paintings that would be exhibited at the French salons. This is a work called The Cattle Market of Rome, in which he shows a kind of heroic, almost ancient Roman scene of butchers clubbing and then about to kill the animals here at the slaughterhouse. And in this picture called The Race of the Riderless Horses, he represents a carnival festival activity where horses are held at one end of the of a long boulevard, and then they're released, and then they're caught at the other end, a kind of running of the bulls at Pamplona sort of event. Highly attuned to the fear of animals as well. And pictures like this, and the previous ones that I've shown, were certainly a basis. Horses, fear, expressive, cow, certainly significant for Pablo Picasso over 100 years later when he produced his great picture called the Guernica. So I'm going to skip about 100 years and look at works by Picasso very briefly. In the Guernica, we see a twisted, tortured horse in the middle with its mouth open, tongue out, and then a cow, a bull, at the upper left. Its naturalistic body here and cubist head pivoted in a direction along with that of the horse. This mural-sized picture was not intended to represent the scene world, but to invoke instead the fear, destruction, and death visited by the Nazi Luftwaffe upon the defenseless Basque town of Guernica in 1937. Here's another way of telling the same story, a poster showing a dead child and the protest against the rebels who were the fascists led by Francisco Franco. But Picasso doesn't want to tell the story in that prosaic a way. He wants to tell it in the way that an animal might see it. He strongly identifies with animals, of course, as we know from his Minotaur Maki, this print, and here's a photograph of Picasso with a bull's mask. What Picasso is trying to do is to tell the story not in a linear fashion, in the form of a narrative, but in a non-linear way or simultaneous way, to erase temporality. That's what Cubists, of course, do, but in this case, a particularly powerful, particularly apposite. Events here don't unfold, they happen all at once. And the story of the destruction of the town and its human and animal inhabitants is told not in a narrative, but in a blinding flash. And here, of course, is the flash of light at the top. Simulating the perceptual cognition of animals, Picasso dispenses with syntax. The story is told not in the sentence, danger and death are raining down from those airplanes up in the sky, we must flee our homes or be killed by German bombs. It is instead expressed by means of the non-syntactic expression of terrified animals. Danger, flee, noise, pain, cry, all at once. It's the untranslated cry of nature, a rhetoric used by humans and animals as well in extremis, in extreme situations, during wartime or in the throes of passion. I'll show just a couple of other works of art that represent this attitude. Francis Bacon, a great disciple of Pablo Picasso, and he extended the language of the outcry. In his paintings, which frequently include animals and slabs of meat, he proposes that humans and animals are subject to the same cruelty and that the agony of the one is no more historic or eventful than that of the other. This work depicts a grotesque male figure in the middle with half-open mouth surrounded by slabs of meat on all sides, above and below. It was inspired probably by a photograph of the Nuremberg trials. It was made the year after those. Here, of course, is Goering in the dock, like the figure here in the dock. We know he collected these photographs and looked at them and frequently copied them. The top of the head is obscured by the gloom of an umbrella and by, of course, that carcass of an animal suspended above him. Figure with meat, picture here at the Art Institute of Chicago, shows a seated man, evidently Pope Innocent X, as depicted by Velázquez, sitting on a throne or a chair between two slabs of beef. The dark background was painted last, giving the figure a tremendous sense of relief. It really stands out from that background. The gap between the two slabs of beef is here, frames the head of the man, and the plane of the chair upon which he sits is coextensive with the meat. Near the top of the two slabs of meat are big, thick wads of red, of blood, kind of clotted blood, and the fists of the man are also clenched, also seemingly with with smears of blood on them. Humanity, Francis Bacon wrote, is nothing but meat. And Figure with Meat, among many other works, is explicit on this point. But it argues equally clearly that animals are also nothing more than meat. Apart from the stray dog, is a dog on a leash, and a painting with dog. Apart from the stray dogs who wander through Bacon's work from time to time, meat is the form in which his animals most frequently appear. This is his three figures from a Crucifixion from 1962. Bacon said, "If I go into a butcher's shop, it is always surprising that I wasn't there instead of the animals." Bacon is not in the least horrified by the cruel treatment of animals, merely surprised that people are not treated in the same terrible way. He believes that freedom and bodily pleasure are ultimately impossible for humans and animals. Even protest is impossible in Bacon's world. For him, the cry of nature, and the scream is perhaps the most important motif in his work. Here's another detail from that picture, but here's the scream, of course. The scream for Bacon is always a strangled expression. It offers no hope of rescue or redemption. It is not even an expression of protest. Bacon's paintings of humans are therefore also paintings of animals, and their outcries are soundless, unheard, and without protest. So a very bleak vision about the confluence of humans and animals. There is a cry of nature that both humans and animals feel and experience, but it is one without, as I say, without redemption. Now, Bacon, therefore, like Hogarth, Stubbs, Jericho, Picasso, and many others whom I discussed today, was an animalist then, not a humanist. But unlike them, he issued no protest about the treatment of animals, only a mute resignation. But many other artists that I've examined, and others that I could have spent more time on, including this work by G.F. Watts, this painting called A Dedication, which shows an angel mourning over the bodies of dead birds whose feathers were used to ornament the plumage hats of Victorian ladies. Many other artists, including Hogarth, Watts, and lots of others, Jericho, Stubbs, had demanded that the reign of humanism should come to an end and that the reign of animalism begin. I'm going to end very quickly with two works by a contemporary artist named Sukkot. One of them is called Modern Man, followed by the Ghosts of His Meat. And you can see the meat, even the license plate says meat, as if it's the town of Meatville. And here's got his McDonald's bag. And I show another one called The Scream, literalizing this outcry that I'm speaking of. This shows a battery hen, a hen who's in a cage. This is the so-called enhanced cages of the animal welfare advocates who would try to improve the cages, the size of the cages that hens are kept in, while not really alleviating the basic suffering that these very sentient animals, and indeed intelligent animals, suffer when they're brought together. So this is an outcry, and of course the picture will remind the art historians among you, which is probably many of you, of a picture by Edvard Munch, The Cry. So I'll end with this, the notion of the common outcry of animals and people in works by Munch, Sukkot, and all the other artists whom I've examined. Thank you, and there's some time, I think, for questions.
Hi. My daughter is a major league dog lover, and when she goes to work every day, she's absolutely certain that the dog is mourning her absence all day long.
Right.
Do you think that a dog has a sense of time?
Yes, but I'm not an expert on that. What I would say, but I have a kind of rule of thumb. They say that a year for a dog is 7 years for a person.
Yeah.
So I feel like their time is collapsed in the same way. So that if you're away for, an hour, it seems like 7 hours for the dog. So they work on a different time scale than people do. And so I think that it's entirely right that when I get home and my dog leaps up in the air, that it seems as if it's been a very long time indeed that we've been away and that we've maybe forgotten them. But that's a very unscientific answer to your question. Other questions? I know that CHF audiences always have lots of questions, so yeah.
Thank you. What do you make of the myth of the founding of Rome with the vivid image of the she-wolf suckling Romulus and Remus?
Right.
You think that there's some together nature and
right.
human?
It's a good question. I haven't thought about that very much. What I would say is that in antiquity, there was a great sense that people who lived outside the the empire, lived differently than we do. They lived the life of what would have been called barbarism, the barboy, those who live around, those who live outside. And so the founding of great civilization, a myth like that, might indicate that it's a exogamous origin, that the origin is not from within, but that people came from outside what would become the empire, and they lived in different ways. So Romulus and Remus suckled by nature, if you will, and they brought this into civilization, and new habits and new forms of society would be developed out of that. Something like that may be going on. That's just a guess, though. Here's a hand over on this side.
Yes, given what you said about the commonality, particularly of emotions and language between people and animals,
right.
Are there any valid arguments for not being a vegetarian?
You know, I would say there aren't any valid arguments. There are certainly many arguments that are made. There are arguments that are made that on marginal lands, for example, where grains can't be grown, that the grazing of cattle on those areas produces food, caloric intake, and proteins that are good supplements to the human diet. However, on the other side of that, the tremendous expense of growing a cow, the amount of water that's used, in addition even from the feed, the amount of water that animals consume, the transport of animals, the cost of all that, even the greenhouse gas emissions from the methane produced from the animal's gut, all argue against a logical acceptance of that particular argument. Obviously, people have, through their cultures, through their customs, grown used to eating animals in large numbers. But I think recognition is growing that on the grounds both of humanity, if you will, animality, kindness, but also on ecological grounds, environmental grounds, sustainability grounds, that consuming meat is not logical. I would imagine that in 50 to 75 years, eating meat will be like smoking cigarettes is today. There's another hand over here.
I was struck by the images of Pope Innocence, and thinking back also to biblical literature, which seems to be the origin of the mankind takes dominance over animals,
Right.
and the story of, I forget which one it was, that was going to sacrifice his son, but instead, Abraham, thank you. And instead, God said, "Oh no, take that sheep over there and use him instead."
Yeah. Bad deal there.
Yeah. The impact of all these religious ideas
Yes.
on our culture and our acceptance of taking shortcuts in our treatment of other creatures.
Right.
Kind of stands out to me. Maybe you could talk about that.
Right. Well, you know, even the Hebrew biblical tradition is ambiguous on this point. According to Genesis, it wasn't until after the fall that humans began to use animal products of any kind, and then only after the flood was it said that you humans will be masters of all the fish in the seas and the birds of the air, etc. You will be, as I forget the phrase, it's not a dictator, but master to them. So it's in the golden age, if you will, before the fall, all humans are vegetarians. And that image is maintained through the Hebrew Bible in the book of Isaiah. And the book of Isaiah then becomes a model for all sorts of other golden age imagery throughout history. The idea that the sheep will lay down with a lamb, and that weapons of war will turn into pruning hooks, So that motif, it's, if you will, as strong a religious motif as any of the others, has, however, been downplayed in subsequent tellings of the religious story. So I would say that even a devout Jew or Christian or Muslim can find support in their holy texts for vegetarianism, or at least for kindness to animals.
I have 2 points. I think there's a scientific theory that in human evolution, eating meat allowed the brain to increase to the size to give man the capabilities that can to do everything, Homo sapiens, the capabilities to do everything that they can do, not all of which is good, but a lot of which is good. So I think there is a theory about meat allowing the brain to grow and humans to evolve. Not making a judgment on whether that's good or bad,
well,
but
it didn't help the saber-toothed tiger. I mean, there are lots of meat-eating creatures who didn't develop the kind of brains that humans did. And indeed, early humans were primarily, now there's debate on some of this, primarily herbivorous. Hunter-gatherers mostly lived by gathering grains, fruits, plants of matter of all kind, and supplement their diet with hunting. So there may be research on that. I'd be rather doubtful of that it's supported by the research, but I've heard such things, yeah.
And my next point is there's also isn't there a lot of school of art, especially in the American art pantheon, like the Hudson River School and this school out west that did a lot of paintings showing the majesty and beauty of animals that made, I guess maybe that was something that came up around the time that animals were being appreciated more?
Right. There are many painters called animaliers, animal painters is the French word for it. In France and England and the United States as well. So there are some of those artists generally, you could say, embrace an animal rights ethic. Rosa Bonheur, the great French animal artist, was, by all accounts, extremely sympathetic toward animals and may have embraced some of these ideas. Others, however, say Remington or Russell would show hunting scenes, or William Hartnett would show trophy pictures. These are ones that don't at all deal with that theme. So the mere representation of an animal independent of the wider artistic and historical and cultural context doesn't necessarily tell us what the attitude of the artist or their community is about animals, animal rights, animal liberation. Thank you.
Have you or others that you may know of extended your studies, your theory, beyond art, this type of art, to across the other creative areas, whether it be music
right.
or theater or dance? And would you find the same thing? Would you believe you find the same sort of treatment of animals, views of animals?
Right. Well, in my book, I treat many different kinds of texts, as well as I'll call it artworks or text, if you will. It's a repository of information and ideas. I also deal with literary works, poetry, the novel, philosophical texts. I don't deal with music, but now that I think of it, I wonder whether there aren't musical texts that could be brought to bear on this question as well. And I'll have to think about that some more. So yes, it's a cross-disciplinary shift in ideas that emerges in the end of the 18th century and which is continuing today. So I need to think about some of those other art forms as well. Thank you.
How do you consider the way Native Americans killed their buffalo and the fact that they said prayers or honored the buffalo before they ate it? Right.
Well, the Native Americans were acting like classic either hunter-gatherers or pastoralists, and they were primarily hunter-gatherers, those who relied upon their vast buffalo herds. And in that sense, it was a highly significant act, the killing of buffalo, and one which would occasion prayers. There are many hunter-gatherers who, when they kill animals, they will believe that the animals are surrendering to them. And if the animal doesn't appropriately come to them, then they cannot rightly kill them. And indeed, there's some scientific evidence that animals, it may seem odd put this way, actually commit suicide. some animals will approach a person, a hunter, with the understanding that it will be taken, perhaps to preserve, to save the other animals around it. So something of that honorific character was very important for Native Americans and many indigenous people around the world. There's a question here too. Yeah, maybe we'll just take just two more. I'm not sure how much time we have.
Okay.
There was a question here and then maybe one more. Yeah.
On the subject of other art forms, do you address the subject of elephant slaughter for ivory and the robust market for carvings, ivory carvings and so forth?
Yes. In my book, I don't talk about it very much. I show a couple of works of art. There's a photographer named Nick Brandt, who has a book called On This Earth a Shadow Falls, which represents much about the killings of elephants. Indeed, many of the elephant subjects in his photographs were subsequently killed for their tusks. So it's still going on at a horrible rate. There are people who still hunt. They pay for their right to hunt. The King of Spain recently was photographed with his family on a safari with a dead elephant in front of it. And of course, the elephants are among the most intelligent and sensitive creatures, the strongest family bonds. The idea of doing that for a sport is just an abomination. There's no way to put it any other way. And there's a question here, I think.
Even as your talk progressed, I was getting increasingly embarrassed by my 4 big canine teeth, which suggests to me that my mouth was built to consume at least some meat. They're for tearing.
Well, you also have an appendix, and you have a coccyx, a little bone down there, a residue of your tail. So there are vestigial organs, and you mostly have molars that are made for chewing. And so, indeed, your canines have no function really in the eating of meat. So, nice try, but.
How would
last question, and then we'll.
How would you put in the fact that most animals eat other animals? Big fish eat little fish. Bigger animals hunt and eat.
They have no choice. That is part of their species being. That is part of their nature. We do not have that as part of our natures. Thank you all very much.